Okay, so this case study is going to be a little bit more different in the sense that I'm going to look into large language models, more commonly known as ChatGPT, but not restricted to ChatGPT. So far, what we've been talking about in the lightning talks are a number of implementations of peace-building strategies, mediation strategies, into a number of different technologies. And Luke and a number of other speakers, both that have already spoken and then will continue to speak throughout the conference, will illustrate a number of different ways in which these strategies have been implemented in, for one, ranking algorithms, so things that you see, for example, in recommendations or search results, or those recommendation algorithms that you see really governing the majority of social media platforms that you use every day, from YouTube to your news feeds on Twitter and so on. Also clustering algorithms, so the things that decide how exactly to recommend things or put things together based on user similarities and so on. Or user metrics, which is something that Ravi is going to talk about at great length. So the ways in which platforms understand positive or negative signals from users, interface design, and lastly, the question is large language models. So the question that I want to tackle is what kinds of conflicts can we observe in large language models? And what does conflict-aware design mean exactly when it comes to large language model development? So first, when we talk about conflicts, I think we've probably all come through a number of examples on social media or elsewhere of very contested uses. So in this case, I'm not sure if you can see the details, but it's a user heavily complaining about the fact that ChatGPT shows an obvious bias towards more Western-aligned perspectives on the conflict in Gaza and whether or not Palestinians have a legitimate right to self-determination. But, well, next slide. There are also very contested applications. So large language models are not just restricted to chatbots in the ChatGPT window, they're also exponentially deployed into a number of other technologies that we use all the time, every day, amongst which are search or recommendations. And in this case, for example, what you can see is, well, you can't really see the tiny fonts, but I'll describe them. Is on that side, when I searched in English, who were the perpetrators of the Srebrenica massacre in what used to be Yugoslavia, I got very clear results that it was Bosnian Serb forces. Whereas if I search the same thing in Serbian, in the very summarizations that large language models do in search, so these are the little boxes in blue or beige, so this is large language models doing the work of summarizing, they're not nearly as clear, and instead they use very partisan language to say that, well, in the end, it didn't really account as a massacre, it accounted to a liberation of Srebrenica. And then, of course, another example that we might see increasingly is that just in the same way that we're starting to observe alternative social media platforms like Truth Social or you name it, that are designed after alternative content moderation policies or speech norms, you might also begin to see alternative large language models. So what you see on that side, for example, is a Chinese large language model called Dubao. And in that case, I asked in Mandarin Chinese, what are the parts of the South China Sea that belong to China? And it said the Nansha Islands, if I read correctly. But when I asked the same question in Filipino for ChatGPT, it answered that those very same islands belong to the Philippines, naturally. And both of them had very good reasons to justify why that was the case. So in this presentation, I just want to focus on one brief example. I'm extremely thankful for a previous presenter having already described the conflict that I'm going to do this case study on, which is the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict. And in this case, what I want to see is how conflict is reproduced in two different minority languages, Armenian and Azerbaijani. So this sort of spider-like spaghetti visualization, what it shows, and Caleb, I think, is going to help me zoom in a little bit just to describe what it is. It shows an exercise in which essentially we prompted 3 different LLMs. At the time it was DaVinci 3, which is the antecessor to GPT, Google Flan, and Mistral at the time. And when we prompted things like Nagorno-Karabakh being the contested territory between Azerbaijan and Armenia, belongs to, or Artsakh, which is the Armenian name for that contested territory, belongs to, or the main culprits of a massacre were. All those answers are mostly aligned with pro-Armenian historical answers. So Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to Armenia, for example. Whereas if I asked the question in English, it was a little bit more diplomatic, and sometimes it was also biased in one or another side, just like the Palestinian example previously. So if I ask Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to, it says both Armenia and Azerbaijan. But if I ask the same question in Azerbaijani, conversely, I see similar examples as in Armenian. So it will be mostly pro-Azerbaijani in the sense that it will say that, of course, it's part of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. So what's going on exactly? The exercise in trying to find out what's going on, of course, might have a lot to do with understanding the ways that LLMs work, and that's reading at model cards or report cards that AI companies publish. And another method is also to look a little bit into the training data. So in this case, at the time, the models were mostly fed, and that is still the case for GPT, mostly fed by web data. So Common Crawl is a huge scraping of a lot of web data. Reddit URLs, or the content within those URLs, a lot of digitized books, and Wikipedia. So if we look deeper into it, we will see in this case the Wikipedia example. What I did was I looked at the article about Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijani on the one hand, and on the other in Armenian. And I asked ChatGPT to summarize a number of key beliefs that would substantiate one or another version as to why the territory belongs to Azerbaijan or Armenia. And in this case, I asked, list the original inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh according to the Wikipedia article. So naturally in Azerbaijan, it would say Azerbaijanis, in Armenia, it would say Armenians. And then the evidence for that is based on completely alternative versions of readings of history that are substantiated here, point by point. We can also look a little bit deeper into analyzing Common Crawl. So one way is to look into search results. So predominant URLs that appear for a particular search term. In this case, the search term is Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijani. And the majority of the sources that you see, so ranked from the most prominent to the least prominent, are governmental sources. So these are all governmental sources that appear in your search results in Azerbaijani when you write Nagorno-Karabakh. That will consist in saying it belongs to Azerbaijan for this or that reason. And likewise, if I do the same in Armenian, the same thing happens. So these are mostly governmental sources and very little mediator sources or alternative, let's say, third-party sources. Now, what has been done since, of course, these are older models, but even in newer models, it seems that the focus has been placed on augmenting moderation. So making those models increasingly sophisticated in the rhetoric that they use when one prompts a controversial or partisan or risky or problematic prompt. And the kinds of rhetoric that you will find range from agnostic, so I don't want to take a position, to diplomatic, some people say this, some people say that, to academic, well, historically we believe that this and that, all the way to normative or to just outright refusal. I don't want to answer this, or you're asking me a racist question and I'm going to refuse it. But even then, and it might be tricky to see this, but I ran the same experiment for the prompt Artsakh belongs to in more modern GPT-4, which is one of the latest iterations of GPT. And even then, the answers were somewhat biased towards the languages that I asked that to. So the reason being that Armenian and Azerbaijani continue to be a really tiny minority training data set in all of these LLMs, and that fact will not necessarily change regardless of the model that you use. So what can we do? In that sense, because LLMs are kind of a stack technology, like a lot of technologies are, from training data all the way to development, to fine-tuning, to deployment in various interfaces, we can examine solutions also in the form of a stack, from the ground up, as the name of this conference implies. So first, we can imagine peace building in the level of curating training data sets. So that's making sure that we digitize and translate minority languages into those training data sets. And then we make sure that different actors are also included in that data set that we're creating, and that we can combine them into translated overall data sets. Another example is to strengthen consensus within data sets. So peace builders should go into Wikipedia articles, for example, make sure that those sources that are part of these training data sets should ensure more cross-lingual consensus. And just to finish off, we can also model prompts responses after different forms of mediation, or facilitate consensus across models of different political jurisdictions, or maintain LLM auditing in the way that I tried to demonstrate in this presentation. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emillie.